To understand what the 40-story glass tower of Kane Security Group means to Chicago, a person would need to stand across from Michigan Avenue at dusk, watch the last light of day burn across each pane of glass, and realize that the building doesn't reflect the city. It devours the city. Kane Security Group isn't a security company in the ordinary sense. It isn't men in uniform standing outside banks or patrolling parking lots. It is an empire operating in the shadows of power, where the most powerful names in Illinois, from senators to chairmen of financial corporations, all have Alaric Kane's direct number saved in their phones and never have to call more than twice. Executive protection, civilian armored vehicles, surveillance systems for 17 of the largest commercial buildings in the Midwest, rapid response units able to arrive within 8 minutes at any point inside the Chicago urban radius. All of it is coordinated by one 40-year-old man from the top floor of that glass tower, with eyes that are always reading everything 3 steps ahead and a voice that never rises above a certain volume, no matter how serious the situation becomes. Alaric Kane is the calmest person in any room he enters, not calm in the sense of being detached or emotionless, but calm in the way of a man who learned very early that emotion is a luxury the one in charge can't afford. He reads people the way other men read topographic maps. A slight furrow of the brow, a breath that falls just a little out of rhythm, a glance slipping to the left before an answer comes. All of it is data. In 20 years of working in security, from a field operative at 20 years old to the CEO of an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Alaric has never once allowed a crisis to move beyond his control. Not once. Except for one thing. Dinner in the house on Astor Street takes place at 7 o'clock, exactly on time, every day of the week. It is the only rule Alaric has set that has nothing to do with work, something like an effort, even if he would never call it that. The oak dining table is long enough to seat 12 people, yet only 2 chairs are pulled out each evening, one at the head and one along the side, far enough apart that conversation requires effort instead of happening naturally. Alaric sits with his back straight. Eli sits across from him, his 7-year-old legs not reaching the floor, swaying lightly in silence. Anything happen at school today? Normal. How was the math test? Fine. Do you want to join any clubs? No. Alaric looks down at his plate. Eli looks down at his plate. The sound of silverware touching porcelain fills the space that 2 males, one grown and one small, don't know how to fill with language. It has been 1 year since this table lost the only person who knew how to keep it from becoming silent. Rosalie had a way of turning dinner into something entirely different, drawing stories out of Eli with questions no one else would have thought to ask, smiling at Alaric across the table with her eyes whenever he tried to look serious about something that didn't deserve seriousness. Without her, dinner has become nothing more than an obligation they both carry out, and both feel relieved to see end. That night, Eli stands and carries his plate into the kitchen as he always does. He stops at the doorway. He doesn't turn around, only speaks into the empty space. Dad, I heard Brutus howling last night. Alaric doesn't look up. His hand is still around his glass of water, his eyes still lowered to the tabletop. Don't go near the training grounds. Eli doesn't answer. He walks into the kitchen. The sound of running water, the sound of dishes. Then silence returns as though it had never been interrupted. Alaric sits alone in the dining room with the yellow light falling across the empty table and realizes that he can no longer remember how long it has been since the last time his son looked straight into his eyes during dinner. Brutus wasn't the kind of dog chosen for size or for the reputation of its breed. He came into the Kane household in a way that Alaric would later never fully be able to explain, not through the kind of strict selection process used for every other asset of Kane Security, but through Rosalie. She saw him at a training facility on the outskirts of Chicago on a Saturday afternoon when Alaric took her there simply because she wanted to go, not because there was any business reason for it. The Neapolitan Mastiff was not yet a year old then, large in an awkward way against a body that had not fully grown into itself, the folds of skin around his face hanging down as though his features had been made from more material than necessary. Every other dog in that facility responded to strangers in ways that could be predicted. Brutus didn't. He sat still in the corner of his enclosure and looked at Rosalie with an expression that the trainer there would later describe as the look of an animal making a decision, not reacting on instinct. Rosalie knelt down in front of the pen door and said nothing. She only placed her hand against the wire mesh. Brutus rose, walked over, and pressed his nose into her palm through the metal openings. Alaric lingered behind her watching the scene and thought he understood what was happening. He was wrong. Brutus was properly registered as a commercial protection dog in the Kane security system, with complete vaccination records, training certifications, and an asset identification number just like every other piece of equipment owned by the corporation. On paper, he was part of the machine. But in the lived reality of the house on Astor Street, Brutus belonged to Rosalie in a way no contract clause could ever describe. Not to Alaric, who signed the registration papers. Not to Garrett Hale, the head of training who had spent hundreds of hours working with the animal, only to Rosalie. And the strange thing was that she never tried to train him in any official sense at all. She didn't use commands, didn't use rewards in any systematic way, didn't use any method Garrett could recognize. She simply stayed with him. On the nights when Alaric came home late from work, the image he most often saw through the kitchen window before stepping inside was Rosalie sitting on the tile floor with her back against the lower cabinets, a cup of tea gone cold in her hand, and Brutus lying pressed close beside her with his massive head resting on her lap. Nothing remarkable was happening. She wasn't petting him in any performative way. He wasn't performing any command. They were simply existing together in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes Rosalie would sing softly, an old lullaby she had learned from her grandmother, the melody simple and unhurried. Brutus closed his eyes every time she sang. Alaric would lean silently against the doorframe and watch, never saying anything, partly because he didn't want to break something he didn't understand, and partly because there was something in that scene that made him feel as though he were standing outside a world those two creatures shared and didn't need him to enter. The red scarf was something Rosalie liked to wrap around Brutus's neck whenever she bathed him, not for any practical reason, only because she liked it and the dog didn't object. Her perfume had soaked into the fabric over the years along with the scent of Brutus, of the family kitchen, of all those evenings on the tile floor. Garrett Hale once asked Rosalie how she managed to control the dog without using any technique at all. She looked at him as though she didn't understand the question. "I don't control him," she said. "I just don't make him feel like he needs to be on guard." Garrett nodded as though he understood, but later he admitted to Alaric that he hadn't truly understood until it was already too late for that understanding to be of any use. There are some things memory doesn't preserve in order, not as a continuous chain of events from beginning to end, but as scattered fragments, sharp and cold, driven into the mind according to no pattern at all. For Alaric, the memory of that day comes back in exactly that way. Not the whole day, only separate moments. The phone ringing at 10:42 that night, the number from the Chicago Police Department appearing on the screen while he was signing off on the final contract of the week. The voice of the officer on the other end, strange in its calmness, reporting a collision on the highway. One vehicle, one woman, and an ending he didn't let them finish describing, because he knew from the first second he heard that voice that this call would divide his life into two halves that would never join again. Then the hospital corridor, the harsh white glare of fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant. A doctor saying something while Alaric watched the man's mouth open and close, but the sound couldn't enter his mind. And Eli, a 6-year-old boy asleep at home with the housekeeper while his mother drove to the airport to pick up an early birthday gift for him, not knowing that his world had changed completely that night while he slept. The funeral took place on a November morning, with Chicago gray beneath a sky that hung over the city like a wet blanket. Many people came, large names from the business and political worlds of Illinois, people Alaric knew by name and knew the reason they had come, yet could not remember a single face after the funeral ended. Alaric held a rigid posture for 3 hours, shaking every hand, nodding through every word of sympathy, not one muscle in his face shifting. Eli remained planted beside his father in a small black suit made in haste, his eyes fixed straight ahead with a calmness that made many of the adults at the funeral glance toward him and then look away again because they didn't know how to face the calmness of a 6-year-old child. The two of them sat side by side in the black limousine on the way home. Neither of them said a word, not because they didn't want to speak, but because each of them was carrying inside his chest a cold stone so heavy there was no breath left to turn into sound. And the stone in one heart wasn't like the stone in the other closely enough for either of them to know how to share it. That night, Alaric walked down the second-floor hallway of the house near midnight and saw Brutus. The massive mastiff was sitting outside Rosalie's bedroom door, motionless as a block of dark stone, his heavy head bowed low, almost touching the wooden floor. He wasn't howling. He wasn't scratching at the door. He was only sitting there and waiting with the patience of a creature that didn't understand the person he was waiting for would never walk out through that door again. Alaric stopped, looked at the dog. The dog didn't look back at him, only kept staring at the closed door as though if he looked at it long enough, it would open. Alaric remained rooted in the dark hallway for who knows how long, his hand resting on the handle of his own bedroom door across from it, watching the animal do exactly what he wouldn't allow himself to do. Then he stepped inside his room, closed the door, and lay down in the dark with his eyes open. The next morning Brutus was still there, still sitting, still waiting, and Alaric knew, even though he couldn't yet name it at the time, that he wasn't the only one who had not slept that night. Brutus's collapse didn't happen in a single night. It unfolded slowly, day by day, week by week, like a building having its foundation pulled out from underneath it before finally coming down. In the first week after the funeral, Brutus refused to eat. Not eating less, not eating slowly, but refusing completely. Garrett Hale, the head of training for Kane Security with 25 years of experience working with service dogs, tried every kind of food from premium kibble to fresh meat, setting the bowl directly in front of the dog, and getting back nothing but a stare that passed through the food bowl, as though it didn't exist. Garrett wrote in the report, "Did not eat on day 3, did not eat on day 5, did not eat on day 7. By the 9th day, Brutus began eating again, but Garrett felt no relief because the dog's eyes while eating were empty, in a way that a man with his years in the profession recognized immediately. Those weren't the eyes of an animal recovering. They were the eyes of an animal continuing to exist because no other choice remained. In the 3rd week, Brutus refused the leash. Garrett approached with the standard lead as he always had, and the dog stood still until the leash touched his neck. Then his body changed in an instant, not gradually, but like a switch being thrown, and Garrett pulled his hand back just before Brutus's jaws snapped shut on empty air less than an inch from his fingers. He stood motionless, his heart pounding, looking at the dog he had worked beside for 3 years, and realizing that the animal standing before him now was no longer the animal he had once known. Not dangerous in the way a dog is trained to attack. Dangerous in the way something becomes when it has been driven into a corner and no longer trusts anything at all. The months that followed moved down a slope that couldn't be reversed. One by one, the 3 most seasoned trainers at Kane Security came out of the training yard with injuries on their hands and arms, every one of them having signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of their employment contract from the first day they were hired. A veterinarian brought in to conduct a full examination left after 12 minutes, with a bandage wrapped around the right wrist. The corporation's 2 highest-ranking bodyguards, men who had handled dangerous field situations most ordinary people would never face in an entire lifetime, both shook their heads when asked whether they were willing to approach Brutus one more time. Garrett Hale knocked on the door of Alaric's office on a Wednesday afternoon, set the thick report down on the desk, and squared his shoulders with the look of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for weeks and still hadn't found a way to begin that would make it easier to hear. Alaric looked at the report and didn't look up. Garrett spoke plainly. Everything Brutus was doing wasn't the behavior of a dog born aggressive, or a dog trained the wrong way. He had worked with enough kinds of service dogs over 25 years to know the difference. Brutus wasn't aggressive. Brutus was in pain. In pain, in a way, no training protocol, no behavioral therapy in the Kane Security arsenal had ever been designed to treat, because Kane Security had been built to protect human beings from threats coming from the outside, not to heal what had broken on the inside. Alaric listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't let his expression shift. When Garrett finished, Alaric gave a single nod, slow and final, then asked in a voice as flat as the glass surface of the desk before him, "What's the next solution?" Garrett looked at him for a second, then down at the report, and then he spoke about someone named Petra Voss in Boston. Alaric wrote the name down on the sheet of paper beside him, underlined it once, and said, "Contact her today." Petra Voss arrived in Chicago on a Monday morning on an early flight from Boston, carrying an old brown leather briefcase worn thin at both corners, and the manner of someone who had no time to be impressed by anything. She was 52 years old, with short, cropped silver hair, thin metal-framed glasses, and a firm handshake of the kind used by people who are used to sizing someone up in the first 10 seconds and never changing their judgment afterward. When the elevator opened on the 40th floor, and she stepped into the corner office overlooking the full Chicago skyline, she didn't look out the window. She looked straight at Alaric Kane standing behind his desk, and spoke before he had the chance to offer a greeting. I need to see the dog's complete file before I decide whether I'm taking this case. Alaric looked at her for 3 seconds. That was usually the amount of time he gave himself to read a person. Garrett stood in the corner of the room, and would later say it was the first time in a year he had seen his boss look as though he wasn't entirely certain of the next step. Alaric signaled for his assistant to bring in the file. Petra sat down in the guest chair. Not the chair Alaric indicated, but the one she chose for herself because it gave her a better view of the door. And she read every page with the speed of someone who wasn't reading, to gather information, but to test whether the information had been presented honestly. 15 minutes later, she closed the file and laid out 3 conditions. First, no one was to enter the training area while she was working, including Garrett. Second, no surveillance cameras for the entire period of her approach. Third, if after 30 days she concluded that the dog couldn't recover in the current environment, that decision would be final, and no one would be allowed to argue against it, with money or authority. Alaric agreed to all 3 conditions, without negotiating a single one. Garrett realized it was the first time in a year he had seen Alaric Kane yield to anyone, without demanding terms in return. Petra began working the next day. She brought no modern equipment and no printed protocol, only a notebook, a low wooden chair she carried in herself, and the patience of someone who had spent 21 years working with animals the world had already given up on. On the first day, she sat 10 feet from the enclosure, said nothing, didn't look directly at him, and simply read a book. Brutus growled continuously for 4 hours. She wrote in the notebook, defensive response, high intensity, consistent. On the 3rd day, she tried placing food closer to the enclosure door than usual. Brutus knocked the bowl over with a shove so precise it looked deliberate. She wrote, refuses intake, not from survival instinct but by choice. On the 7th day, she tried sitting closer, less than 5 feet away. Brutus rose and pressed himself against the barrier with a look that made Petra, who had once sat in the same space with some of the most dangerous service dogs ever brought into her rehabilitation facility, feel the muscles in her back stiffen for one brief beat before she forced her body to relax and remained seated. 21 days passed that way. Each day brought a different method, and each method failed in a different enough way that Petra couldn't call it repeated failure. She had to call it a wall with many surfaces, and she was touching each one without finding a grip. On the 21st day, she packed up her chair and notebook, walked out to the parking lot, got into the driver's seat of the rented Volvo, and didn't start the engine for 20 minutes. Outside the windshield, the wind off Lake Michigan moved across the empty Kane security parking lot. Petra looked at the notebook on the passenger seat. 21 days of dense observations, and for the first time in her career, she couldn't find in those pages a single next step worth trying. 9 days remained. She opened the notebook to the final blank page, stared at it for a moment, then closed it again without writing a word. While Petra Voss sat in the parking lot with her notebook closed, and 9 remaining days counting down, upstairs in the house on Astor Street, Eli Kane was sitting in the place he sat more than anywhere else in the entire 8,000-square-foot house. Not the playroom with the toy shelves Alaric had arranged to be decorated before last year's birthday. Not the living room with the sofa imported from Italy that no one ever sat on long enough to leave an impression, but the small moss-green reading chair set beside the bedroom window, where he could look down into the corner of the backyard and see part of the training facility roof rising behind the line of old pine trees. Eli sat there with a sketchbook on his knees and a pencil held loosely in his hand. He had been drawing since before he knew how to read, but what he had drawn over the past year was completely different from the pictures that came before. Before, they had been the things children usually draw, a house and trees and a sun in the upper corner. Now they were faces. His mother's face in profile when she was smiling, the faint crease at the corner of her eye that no one else noticed but Eli had recreated with such exactness that the housekeeper once picked up the paper, looked at it, then set it back down without being able to say a word. And Brutus, that enormous head with the folds of skin falling around the muzzle, the heavy eyes looking straight at the artist in the way Eli brought back with pencil lines so light they were almost invisible, yet somehow created such depth that anyone looking at the drawing had the feeling the animal inside it was breathing. He didn't cry when he drew. He didn't cry in general. Since the night he sat in the black limousine coming home from the funeral, Eli Kane had not cried in front of anyone, not even when he was alone. Not because he wasn't in pain, but because his pain didn't take the shape of tears. It took the shape of silence, of one-word dinners, of sitting beside the window and staring down at the roof of the training facility until it was fully dark outside without ever turning on the bedroom light. His teacher once called Alaric to say that Eli was doing well in school and wasn't showing any problems, only that he didn't play with the other children during recess, but sat alone on the bench and watched. Alaric thanked her and hung up. He didn't know what to do with that information except register it. Dinner that evening unfolded as it always did. Food prepared by the housekeeper, 2 sets of silverware, yellow light falling over the long oak table. Alaric asked about homework. Eli answered, "Finished." Alaric asked about physical education. Eli answered, "Normal." Alaric opened his mouth as if to ask something more, but couldn't find the right question, so he let it go. Eli finished his meal, arranged his knife and fork neatly the way Rosalie had taught him, then stood and carried his plate into the kitchen. Alaric heard the sound of running water, the soft sound of the plate being placed into the sink, then the small footsteps stopping at the kitchen doorway that opened into the dining room. There was a short pause before Eli's voice rose, neither loud nor soft, calm in a way that only felt heavy after it had already been heard. "Dad, I heard Brutus howling last night." Alaric didn't turn around, his hand still around his water glass. "Don't go near the training grounds." No other sound came from the kitchen doorway, only the small footsteps moving down the hall, the faint click of a bedroom door closing, and the familiar silence returning to fill the dining room the way water fills a vessel. Alaric still hadn't cleared out Rosalie's room. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It was simply that every time he stood in front of that door with the intention of stepping inside and beginning, something in him chose instead to turn away and deal with something else, rather than face what waited within. So everything remained exactly where it had been after 12 months. The coat on the hook behind the door, the perfume bottle on the vanity, and the red scarf Rosalie used to drape over the back of the chair by the window, because she said it was easier to reach there than tucked away in a drawer. Eli went into his mother's room on a Thursday afternoon while the housekeeper was out shopping, and Alaric was in a meeting downstairs on the office floor. He didn't go in to look around or to cry. He went in because there was something he needed to take, and he had thought about it long enough to know with certainty what it was he wanted. He stood in the doorway for a second, breathing in lightly through his nose. His mother's perfume was still there, but much fainter than the last time he had come inside, fading month by month in the one way no one could stop. He walked straight to the chair by the window, without looking toward the vanity, without looking up at the coat hook. The red scarf was still draped in the same place. Eli picked it up with both hands, lifted it close to his face, and drew in one long breath, closing his eyes for a few seconds. Then he folded the scarf carefully into a small rectangle, slipped it into the pocket of his jacket, and left the room, easing the door shut behind him. In the days that followed, after school and before dinner, Eli often stood at the corner of the wire fence that separated the backyard from the training grounds. Not close, not trying to climb over or squeeze through, only standing at a distance that allowed him to watch without being seen by anyone in the house through the windows. From that corner, he could observe Brutus in the small yard outside the enclosure during the hour when Garrett let him out for exercise, though lately Garrett had been letting him out less and less because every release had become a risk for anyone who happened to pass by. Brutus paced. He didn't run, didn't play, didn't explore his surroundings the way dogs usually do when they are let outside. He only moved along a fixed path, from one corner to the other, then back again, repeating it as though patrolling a perimeter only he could see. From time to time he stopped, lifted his head, and looked toward the main house, holding that posture for several seconds before lowering his head again and continuing on. Eli stood there watching and understood it on the third afternoon he came to the fence. Understood it in a way that didn't require anyone to explain, didn't require psychological terms or thick behavioral reports filled with data. Brutus was waiting in the way someone waits when he knows the person he is waiting for isn't coming back, yet can't stop waiting, because to stop would mean admitting something his body and heart aren't ready to admit. Eli knew what that looked like from the outside because he had seen it every day in the mirror, without realizing it was a mirror until now. That night, Eli took the red scarf out of his jacket pocket, smoothed it flat with care, and tucked it inside his pillow beneath the pillowcase, in the place only he knew. Then he opened the drawer of his desk, moved a few math books aside, and placed inside it a packet of Brutus's dry food that he had taken from the storage room near the enclosure the week before, when he passed by and found the door left open. He didn't have a specific plan. There was no step 1, step 2, step 3 in his mind. It was only that he had seen something no one else had seen, and something inside him knew it wasn't time to walk away yet, even though he still didn't know when that time would come or what he would do once it did. Day 28 of the 30 days Alaric had allowed came on a Wednesday night at the end of October, when the autumn storm rolling in from Lake Michigan hit Chicago, in the way people who have lived in the city long enough can recognize from the afternoon just by the smell in the air. That cold, damp, heavy scent of a vast lake being driven toward shore before the sky has even fully broken open. By 9 o'clock that night, the wind was already strong enough to rattle the second-floor windows of the house on Astor Street. By 11, the rain was coming down sideways, lashing the front of the building in relentless sheets of water. And by 11:20, lightning struck somewhere near the industrial district to the east, close enough that the thunder that followed wasn't a distant rumble but a sharp, the solid explosion that made the window frames tremble and knocked out the entire power system of the training facility behind the house in a single instant. Alaric wasn't home at the time. One of his escort convoys had run into trouble on Interstate 90. The client was an Illinois state senator on the way from O'Hare Airport back into downtown, and Alaric was handling the situation from the office floor of the glass tower, through 3 communication screens at once. Garrett Hale was on the eastern side of the grounds, inspecting a new barrier system installed after an incident the week before. The only night guard left at the training facility heard the power cut out, looked at the dead control panel, and ran straight toward the backup electrical cabinet at the far end of the building to fix it before the automatic alarm system could trigger and throw the entire property into chaos. Eli was asleep when the second clap of thunder struck. He sat upright in the complete darkness, his eyes opening to a room without a single source of light, even the small night lamp beside his bed gone dark with the power. He wasn't afraid of the dark in the way many 7-year-old children are, because after his mother died, he had grown used to sleeping without light, grown used to the quiet darkness of night, in a way no child that age ever should have to. He sat still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting his ears listen, and in the silence between 2 crashes of thunder, through the sound of rain beating against the windows, and the wind whistling through the cracks, he heard it. The howl from the training grounds, not the short howl or the aggressive growl he had grown used to hearing drift up on earlier nights. This was long and unbroken, rising high and then falling low with the rhythm of something being driven into a corner not by what was outside it, but by what was inside. Eli sat on the bed and listened, and he knew at once, in the same way he had known from those afternoons standing outside the fence watching Brutus circle without end, that this wasn't the sound of an animal making a threat. It was the sound of an animal in fear with no one beside him. Eli got out of bed. He took the red scarf from beneath his pillow and wrapped it around his neck. He opened the desk drawer, took out the packet of dry food, and shoved it into his coat pocket. He pulled the zipper of his coat up to his chin. He stepped into the sneakers beside the bed without tying the laces. He moved out into the dark hallway, down the stairs with one hand on the rail, through the kitchen, and out the back door. The rain came down on him at once, cold and heavy, soaking his hair within seconds. Eli didn't stop. He crossed the backyard toward the training grounds, his head slightly lowered against the wind, his small feet pressing into the waterlogged grass, moving toward the sound of the unbroken howl carrying through the rainy Chicago night. The entrance to the training facility had a 4-digit code lock mounted on the right side, the kind of simple keypad Kane Security used for secondary areas that didn't require the highest level of clearance. Eli had seen Garrett enter that code no fewer than 10 times during the afternoons, when he had been allowed to follow him around the outdoor section of the property, back before Brutus became dangerous and everything was locked down. He entered the 4 numbers with his index finger, slowly and carefully, while his other hand held the edge of his coat to shield the keypad from the rain striking against it. The small green light on the lock blinked once. The door opened. Inside, it was darker than outdoors, because no flashes of lightning reached in, only the strip of red emergency lights running low along the base of the wall, the kind of backup lights that switch on automatically when the main power fails, casting just enough glow to reveal shapes, but not enough to show detail. Eli stood still in the doorway for a second to let his eyes adjust. The smell inside was the smell of damp concrete and dry food, and something heavier that he had no word for but recognized at once as the scent of an animal under unbearable strain. The howling had stopped when he opened the door, but in its place came the sound of constant movement from deeper inside, claws scraping against concrete, heavy, fast-breathing, carrying out from the darkness, at the far end of the corridor, leading into the kennel area. Eli stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. He walked down the short corridor, his left hand brushing lightly against the wall to guide himself, until the iron bars of the kennel enclosure appeared in the dim red light. Brutus was standing in the middle of the pen, all 80 kilograms of him rigid from head to tail, his head lowered beneath his shoulders, in the posture any adult ever trained around working dogs would recognize as the most dangerous posture of all. When Eli came into view, Brutus turned his head. In the red light, his eyes looked like two wet stones reflecting the glow, neither warm nor cold, only the expression of a creature balanced on the edge between panic and eruption, without yet falling fully toward either one. A low growl beat arise from his chest, the sound spreading through the concrete floor and up the walls and into the damp air like a warning carried by frequency rather than by language. Eli didn't step back. He looked straight at the animal for a few seconds, then slowly sat down on the floor just outside the enclosure, legs crossed, back straight, as though he were lowering himself into a chair at school, rather than onto the cold concrete floor of an isolation kennel close to midnight on a storm-soaked night. He took the packet of dry food from his coat pocket and placed it on the floor beside him, without pushing it through the bars, simply leaving it there. Then he removed the red scarf from around his neck, held it in both hands, and lifted it to his chest. Brutus was still growling, but his nose was working before his mind, processing the information in the air at a speed no human sense could ever match. Rosalie's perfume on the red woolen fabric faded greatly after 12 months, but still there. Still enough to awaken something deeper than reflex, deeper even than the panic racing through the animal's nervous system. Brutus stopped. The growl broke off in the middle as though cut with scissors. His head lifted slightly, his nose flaring fast as he read the scent in the air a second time and then a third. Eli began to sing, not loudly, not with intention, only because he remembered the song and sang it the way his mother used to, softly and evenly and without hurry, the lullaby Rosalie had often sung in the kitchen on the evenings before Eli went to bed, while Brutus lay at her feet listening. His voice wasn't perfect, and it trembled a little from the cold, but the melody was right, and the pauses were right, and the scent on the scarf in his hands was right in the way nothing had been right in the past year. Brutus took one step toward the bars, then another. Then he sat down just inside the enclosure, less than 3 feet from Eli, his eyes fixed on the red scarf in the boy's hands, with the look of a creature trying to recognize something it knew was real, but couldn't believe was possible. Eli kept singing. By the third line, he heard the kennel latch, looked down, and saw that his own hand had opened it without him realizing when, the action born from the instinct of a child who doesn't calculate risk the way adults do. The kennel door swung open. Brutus didn't charge out. He remained seated and watched. Eli stepped inside, sat down on the floor, placed the red scarf across his lap, and kept singing. Brutus came closer the final time in slow, heavy steps. He stood in front of the boy for a moment, his hot breath falling over Eli's wet hair. Then that enormous head with its sagging folds of skin lowered, touched the red scarf on Eli's lap, and lay down. The full weight of him settled onto the concrete beside the boy's legs, his breathing gradually slowing and evening out. Eli stopped singing. He placed his hand on Brutus's head, very gently, and sat still in the dim red light. Tears ran down his face without sound, without a sob, only falling like something that had been held back too long and had now found its own way out, because for the first time in a year, something warm was staying beside him and showing no sign of leaving. Alaric came home at 2 o'clock in the morning when the storm had lost some of its violence, but the rain was still falling, his coat wet from the parking area all the way to the front door. He turned off the alarm, hung the car keys on the hook beside the door out of a habit unchanged for 10 years, and stepped into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water before going upstairs. Every one of those movements happened by inertia, the way they do for a man who has repeated them so many times. His mind no longer has to direct them. He climbed the stairs, walked down the dark hallway, and pushed Eli's bedroom door open slightly, as part of his habit of checking before going into his own room, a habit formed after the day Rosalie died, one he had never fully noticed becoming his. The room was empty. Alaric stood in the doorway looking into the darkened room, his eyes sweeping over the bed with its blankets in disarray, over the chair by the window with no one in it, over the desk where one drawer stood partly open. His mind processed the information in less than 3 seconds before he turned and moved quickly down the stairs. Not running, not yet running, still trying to hold on to the calm that had carried him through 20 years in his profession. He checked the kitchen, checked the living room, checked the first-floor bathroom. Nothing. Then he looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard, and saw that the training facility door wasn't fully closed, a faint red line of light slipping through the narrow opening into the rainy night. Alaric ran. Not moved quickly, not took hurried steps, but truly ran, through the back door, across the water-soaked grass, with the rain striking straight into his face, and no attempt to shield himself from it. It was the first time in a year that Alaric Kane had run not because of a schedule or an operational emergency, but because of fear. Fear in its purest and least controllable form, the kind he had forgotten the feel of since learning long ago how to lock it away. He shoved the training facility door open, slipped slightly on the wet floor at the entrance, caught himself with one hand against the wall, and moved farther inside. The red emergency lights were still working, casting just enough dim light to make out shapes. Alaric crossed the short hallway into the kennel area and stopped. The kennel door was open. Inside, Eli was asleep, leaning against Brutus's side, his head tilted slightly to one side, his hair still wet from the rain, Rosalie's red scarf wrapped loosely around his wrist and trailing down onto the floor. Brutus lay pressed close beside the child, his huge body curved like a living wall around the boy. Then Brutus heard him. The animal lifted his head in total silence. He didn't howl, didn't growl at once, only stared straight at Alaric, with the eyes of a creature just awakened from the first rare state of peace he had known in a year, and now deciding what the man standing before him was. Then he rose, slowly and without noise, and stood tall between Alaric and Eli. The fur along his spine lifted. A low growl began to vibrate in his chest, not loud, but clear and steady, a language that needed no translation. This is the boundary, and you are standing on the wrong side of it. Alaric didn't step back, but he didn't move forward either. He held his ground in the dim red light, looking at the 80-kilogram animal standing between him and his 7-year-old son, and realized with a strange kind of clarity that this was the first time in a year something was protecting Eli in a way he himself had failed to do. Eli steered, his eyes opened, blurred and slow with the heaviness of deep sleep just broken, and he looked up at Brutus, standing in front of him, then past the dog's shoulder toward the doorway where Alaric stood. He didn't panic, didn't jerk upright, only looked at his father for a moment with the calm of a child who had slept enough and was now taking in the situation in a way that would have startled most adults. "Dad, don't," Eli said, his voice a little rough with sleep, no louder than it needed to be. He just needed someone who wouldn't leave. He laid his hand on Brutus's back, and the animal lowered the fur along his spine a little, the growl gradually fading, though his eyes still didn't leave Alaric. Alaric looked at his son's hand resting on the dog's back, looked at Rosalie's red scarf wrapped around the boy's wrist, looked at the way Brutus stood still beneath that hand, in a way he hadn't stood still beneath anyone's touch in a full year. He lowered his own hand slowly, and sat down on the cold concrete floor just outside the kennel doorway, his back against the iron barrier, his legs stretched out in front of him. He said nothing. There was no business reason for what he did, no strategy, no objective beyond the fact that he could no longer remain standing in the way he had never before allowed himself to admit. Brutus watched him sit down, watched for a while, then slowly lay back down beside Eli. In that concrete room with its dim red lights and the sound of rain carrying in from outside, 3 living beings sat in silence, each carrying a different cold stone inside the chest, and for the first time in a year, none of them was carrying it alone. Petra Voss arrived at the training facility at 7 o'clock the next morning according to her usual schedule, carrying her notebook and the pencil worn nearly down after 21 days of recording observations. She had prepared herself for day 22 in the way she had learned to do, which meant expecting nothing and writing down whatever happened, whether it proved meaningful or not. But when she opened the door to the corridor leading into the kennel area, she stopped in the doorway and didn't take another step for nearly a full minute. Eli was sitting on the concrete floor beside Brutus's food bowl, his sketchbook open on his knees, drawing with the slow ease and naturalness of someone sitting in his own living room. Brutus stood beside the bowl, head lowered, eating steadily and normally, now and then lifting his head to glance at Eli once before lowering it again. No tension, no wariness, no sign at all of the animal that had refused every form of contact for an entire year. Petra opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote down 2 words, then underlined them. Total transfer. Not recovery in the sense she had once understood it. Something else. Something for which her 21 years of experience had no ready name. The news arrived at noon that day in the way the worst news usually does, without warning and never at the right moment. Diane Whitmore called Alaric at 12:15 from her law office downtown, her voice carrying that flat and careful quality of someone delivering bad news that had already been checked and verified before being spoken aloud. Rex Caldwell, the head of Caldwell Protection Services and Kane Security's biggest rival in the Chicago market for the past 4 years, had filed a petition in Illinois Civil Court early that morning. The action was based on the Illinois Animal Control Act, asking the court to order Brutus seized and processed under the regulations governing animals determined to be dangerous, while also seeking an investigation into whether Kane Security had concealed information about incidents on private grounds. Diane finished reading the summary, and then added one more sentence, the one Alaric knew mattered most. Someone on the inside had supplied internal documents to Caldwell, including footage from the old security cameras. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the Chicago Tribune had posted a story with a headline on the homepage of its online edition, accompanied by a 30-second video clip showing Brutus in the kennel months earlier, enough for viewers without context to see exactly what Caldwell wanted them to see. From that point on, Alaric's phone began vibrating without pause. 3 board members within a single hour, 2 major contract partners calling to ask after the situation in the way that was really meant to assess the scale of the damage before deciding their own next move. Garrett stood at the office door with the expression of a man who wanted to say something but couldn't find a sentence useful enough to offer. Alaric sat behind his desk, took each call, answered in short, non-committal phrases, and looked out through the window toward the backyard, where he could see the shapes of Eli and Brutus sitting beneath the old pine trees. The Chicago Animal Control Team arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon, with an emergency detention order issued by the court that morning. 2 officers came. One of them, a man named Carl Briggs, who had been doing this work for more than 15 years, bringing standard equipment and the air of someone who had handled enough situations not to be surprised by anything. Garrett led them out to the backyard. Brutus lifted his head when he heard the footsteps of strangers, rose slowly, and moved to stand in front of Eli. Not noisily, not aggressively, only standing there with all 80 kilograms of him, forming a barrier between the 2 officers and the child like a wall with no sign of moving. Carl Briggs stopped at a safe distance and watched the dog for a moment, with the professional eye of someone who reads animal behavior not by instinct, but by accumulated experience. No raised hackles, no attack posture, only the steady, deliberate presence of an animal doing exactly the one thing he had been made to do. Briggs stepped back once, signaled for his partner to stop, then spoke quietly, but clearly enough for Garrett to hear. "This dog isn't out of control. He's performing a duty." He wrote something into the report, then looked up at Garrett. "I need to speak with the homeowner." The Illinois Civil Courthouse stood on West Randolph Street, a gray granite building raised in the 1950s, with broad hallways and high ceilings in the kind of architecture designed to make human beings feel smaller than the law operating inside it. Courtroom 7 on the 3rd floor, Monday morning, had its public seats filled 15 minutes before the hearing even began, most of them occupied by reporters and people from Chicago's private security industry who had come to watch a case everyone understood wasn't simply about a dog. Alaric sat at the defense table beside Diane Whitmore, his back straight, his hands resting flat on the table, his face holding the same neutrality he had carried into every boardroom for the past 10 years. Eli wasn't in the courtroom today. He was still at home with Garrett and Brutus, and that was the only thing Alaric truly wanted to know before the hearing began. Gordon Price rose with the bearing of a man who knew he stood on the side with the advantage and didn't need to pretend humility about it. He was 53 years old, with neatly cut salt and pepper hair, an expensive navy suit costly in a quiet rather than flashy way, and the voice of someone who had stood before judges enough times to know exactly what volume carried authority, without ever requiring him to raise it. He opened not with legal reasoning, but with numbers, because numbers are the language of civil court, and he knew that better than anyone. 7 Kane Security employees injured on company private grounds over the course of 12 months, 3 of them requiring hospitalization, the total medical costs and settlement payouts recorded in internal files that Price read line by line, in a voice even and without emotion. Then he pressed a button on the podium, and the large screen behind him lit up with the same 30-second clip the Chicago Tribune had posted. Footage of Brutus inside the kennel displaying behavior that needed no added commentary for anyone in the courtroom to understand why they were sitting there. Price let the video run to the end, then turned back toward Judge William Barker with the air of a man who had just finished presenting the portion that required no debate and was now arriving at the part that truly mattered. His argument was simple and precise to the point of cruelty. Kane Security Group was a company that provided professional security services to clients who trusted them with their safety. A company like that, unable to control its own asset on its own grounds, allowing injuries to its own employees for 12 consecutive months without any effective corrective action, wasn't merely violating the Illinois Animal Control Act. It was demonstrating through its conduct that its capacity to guarantee safety was itself a question that deserved to be asked before the public and before the court. He ended with a sentence that needed no extra emphasis because its weight spoke for itself. If Kane Security can't control this, the court must ask what it can control. Diane Whitmore rose when Judge Barker turned toward the defense table. She carried very little paper, only a thin folder and a small notebook, the style of someone who knew a strong argument didn't need much paper behind it. She began with the language of the very statute Price had just invoked, the Illinois Animal Control Act, specifically the section defining a dangerous animal, which required evidence of dangerous or attacking behavior outside a controlled, enclosed environment, not inside private grounds where every person present was an employee who had signed labor agreements, including clauses acknowledging occupational risk. Brutus had never left Kane Security property since the incidents began, had never been exposed to members of the public, had never caused any event in a public space. The legal foundation of the petition was, technically, far weaker than Gordon Price had presented it. Then Diane paused for a beat before speaking the next sentence. The one she knew was the only sentence that truly mattered in this entire opening statement. Brutus wasn't an uncontrollable animal under the meaning of the law, because there was someone who could control him. And that person, Your Honor, was a 7-year-old child. She looked directly at Judge Barker. Proof of that, Your Honor, will be presented at the next hearing. The second hearing took place on Wednesday morning of that same week. And this time the number of people waiting in the hallway outside courtroom 7 was greater than the number of empty seats inside. Diane Whitmore called the defense's first and only witness almost immediately after Judge Barker declared the session open. James Foley entered through the side door, a 61-year-old man with the slow, steady gait of someone who didn't hurry because he knew he would arrive exactly where he needed to be, with short white hair, a simple brown suit, and nothing about him that suggested importance except the way people in the room naturally stopped their private conversations when he walked past. He had been a behavioral psychologist, specializing in working dogs for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 17 years before moving into independent research, had published 4 academic studies on attachment behavior in large guardian breeds, and was the only name on Diane's list of potential witnesses who, when she called and explained the situation, replied at once without needing another question. I know this case already. I'll be there. Foley sat in the witness chair, resting both hands on the arms in an easy and unguarded way, then looked around the room once before Diane began asking questions. He didn't look at a file. He didn't look at notes. He only looked straight ahead and spoke like a man recounting what he knew rather than reading back what he had prepared. Diane asked him about the Neapolitan Mastiff, and he began not with breed characteristics or research data, but with history, because he said that to understand an animal's behavior, one must understand what it was created to do and by whom across how many generations. The Neapolitan Mastiff, he explained in an even and unhurried voice, is a breed dating back to ancient Rome, selected over thousands of years not to obey commands, but to form attachment, not attachment to a pack or to a place or to a type of work, but to one specific person. That is why this breed isn't trained in the conventional sense, but guided through relationship, and that is also why, when the person they choose is lost, their response doesn't resemble the response of any other breed. Foley looked toward Judge Barker when he spoke the next sentence, not because it was a courtroom rule, but because that was the person he needed to speak to. When the person, a Neapolitan Mastiff, is bonded to dies, the animal isn't aggressive in the sense of attacking from instinct or territory. The animal is grieving. The animal is processing loss in the only way its nervous system is built to process it, by pushing away everything that isn't the person it is searching for, because every contact from someone else reminds it that the one it needs isn't here anymore. He paused for a beat and then said it plainly. What happened on Kane Security grounds over the past 12 months isn't evidence of an animal out of control. It is evidence of an animal in pain, in a way that no one in the entire training and medical system that approached him recognized, because they were trying to correct behavior when the problem lay somewhere else entirely. Diane asked about the night of the storm, and Foley answered more briefly, More exactly. What the boy Eli Kane did wasn't retraining the dog, and it wasn't any therapeutic method with a name in any textbook. The boy sat down beside the animal's pain and didn't leave. That was all. That was the only thing the animal needed. And it was the only thing that no adult had truly managed to do in all 12 of those months. Diane nodded and turned toward the presentation console. The large screen behind the witness stand lit up. The Storm Night security footage, pulled from Kane Security's backup storage system, began to play in the complete silence of the courtroom. The camera angle was high, the red emergency lighting dim, the image grainy and unclear, but still sharp enough to show everything that mattered. A small child walked into the kennel door, sat down on the floor, lowered his head and began a slight movement in his shoulders. The rhythm of someone singing, even though the video itself carried no sound. The 80-kilogram animal stood still for a moment. Then, one step at a time, he moved closer. Then he lay down and placed his head in the child's lap. The video ended there, frozen on the still image of the child and the animal in the dim red light. The courtroom fell silent in a way different from the ordinary silence of a courtroom, not silence born of rule, but silence because no one could find a reason to break it in that moment. Judge Barker looked at the screen for a while after the image had gone dark. Alaric looked down at the table. Foley sat motionless in the witness chair with both hands resting straight on the arms, with nothing more he needed to say. Judge Barker turned toward the plaintiff's table. Gordon Price sat upright, looking at the file before him, turning one page and then turning it back, then setting down his pen. He looked up and said 3 words. "No questions, Your Honor." Diane Whitmore rose after the silence Gordon Price had left behind, and told Judge Barker that the defense had one more person who wished to speak under the provision for directly affected parties in the Illinois Animal Control Act. Price lifted his head from the file and opened his mouth to object, but Judge Barker had already raised a hand before he could speak, glanced at the case file for a second, and then nodded his permission. The courtroom door opened, and Garrett Hale entered leading Eli Kane, the boy dressed in a pale blue shirt and dark trousers in the way that made it obvious someone had prepared him carefully that morning. His hair combed more neatly than usual, his left hand holding the red scarf folded into a small rectangle. Eli walked in without looking around the room, without looking at the gallery, or the plaintiff's table, or even toward his father seated at the defense table. He walked straight to where Diane indicated, to a chair placed separately near the witness stand, but not on it, lower than the stand, and without a microphone, because Diane had asked the technical staff to adjust the sound so that Eli's natural voice could still be heard without equipment. Eli sat down. He placed both hands in his lap, the red scarf resting neatly in his left palm. Judge Barker looked down at him from the elevated bench with the expression of a man who had presided over hundreds of cases, but was not accustomed to looking down at someone this small in his courtroom. He spoke more gently than usual. "You may say anything you want to say." Eli didn't look up at the judge. He looked down at the red scarf in his hand, his thumb brushing lightly along the edge of the fabric in a way only someone watching closely would notice. And then he began to speak in the ordinary voice of a 7-year-old child, not trying to sound more important than his age. "Brutus didn't hurt me," he said, "because I wasn't trying to make him forget Mom. I just sang the song Mom used to sing, and he knew I missed her too." He paused for a beat, still looking at the scarf, then added the final sentence in the way of someone saying aloud a thought he had carried for a long time without finding the right moment to speak it. "I think he waited a whole year because nobody would sit down beside him long enough for him to understand that person wasn't going to leave, just like I was waiting too." The courtroom fell completely silent after that. Not the silence of politeness, or the silence of anticipation, but the silence of people who had just heard something touch a place they had not prepared to have touched. Someone in the gallery behind them cleared a throat softly and then stopped. Diane looked down at the file in front of her. Foley remained seated in the witness chair, not yet dismissed, staring straight ahead. Alaric Kane sat at the defense table with his back straight and both hands flat on the tabletop, in exactly the same posture he had held through the entire hearing. But there was something at the corner of his eyes that Diane, seated beside him, saw and then turned her gaze away from. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew it was not something meant to be witnessed publicly. For the first time in a year, Alaric Kane's eyes had gone red. Judge William Barker looked at Eli for a moment, after the boy had finished speaking, then lowered his eyes to the file before him and turned through several pages with the slow, deliberate motions of a man who had already read those pages many times before entering the courtroom that morning, and only needed a little time for everything he had just heard to settle into its proper place in his mind before he spoke. He set down his pen, looked straight ahead, and began his ruling in a voice that wasn't loud, but clear and steady in the stillness of the courtroom. Based on all evidence presented, including behavioral records, expert reports, security camera materials, and the statement of the directly affected party, the court finds that the conditions required to apply the seizure provision under Illinois Animal Control Act Section 15 have not been met. The evidence doesn't show an uncontrollable animal. The evidence shows an animal that is controllable by one specific person within one specific relationship into which this court has no legal basis to interfere. The petition for seizure is denied. Brutus will remain with the Kane family. He struck the gavel once, the sound carrying through the courtroom, and then dissolving into silence, and Eli Kane remained seated in the small chair with the red scarf in his hand, his eyes still lowered, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, in a way that only someone who had known him long enough would recognize as a smile. They came out of the courthouse close to 12 o'clock at noon, with Chicago's autumn sunlight falling across the granite steps at the slanted angle of late morning, golden and cold in the way this city always is in October. Alaric walked one step ahead, Diane beside him saying something about the next legal steps needed to close the case, while Eli followed behind with the red scarf held loosely in his hand. When they reached the third step, Alaric slowed without any clear reason, and his hand moved downward on its own, his fingers finding Eli's small hand and closing around it in a way that had not existed in any plan or conscious decision he had made that morning. Eli didn't pull away. He simply kept walking down the remaining steps with his small hand resting in his father's, looking straight ahead as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world, as though an entire year had not passed between the last time and this one. Petra Voss was waiting at the foot of the steps with her old leather briefcase over her shoulder and a flight back to Boston at 3 o'clock that afternoon. She shook Alaric's hand briefly, and then said what she had been thinking since early that morning, speaking plainly in the way she always did. "Do you know why your son did what my whole team couldn't do? Because the boy wasn't trying to heal the dog. He just sat down beside the pain and stayed there." She looked at Alaric for a second in the way of someone about to say something more important than everything that had come before it. "You should try doing the same with your son." Then she turned and walked toward the parking lot without waiting for an answer, because she knew the answer that mattered most wasn't the one spoken aloud, but the one lived out in action. That night Garrett Hale knocked on the door of Alaric's study after dinner. Holding a handwritten note he said he had meant to deliver many times over the past year, but had put away each time because he didn't know whether it would help or only make everything heavier. He placed the sheet of paper on the desk and explained. In the first week after Rosalie died, when Brutus refused food and refused every form of contact, there had been one evening when Garrett stood outside the kennel and accidentally noticed the animal suddenly lie down and begin breathing evenly again for about 15 minutes. He watched and didn't understand why until he realized the housekeeper was cooking in the main house and had turned on the radio by accident, and the song playing at that moment was the one Rosalie used to sing in the kitchen every night. Garrett looked at Alaric. "She left something inside that dog that we couldn't see because we were looking for something that could be fixed, instead of something that needed to be remembered. Eli saw it because the boy was carrying the same pain in the same way." 1 year later, on a late October morning, Lincoln Park spread beneath the blue and cold Chicago sky of late autumn. The grass turned golden under the trees lining the path along the lake, the wind blowing in from Lake Michigan carrying the clean chill of a season about to change. Eli ran across that yellow grass with the red scarf wrapped loosely around his neck and fluttering behind him in the wind, laughing in the way of an 8-year-old child who doesn't need a special reason to laugh beyond the fact that he is running and the day is beautiful and someone is running beside him. Brutus ran next to him in long, heavy, steady strides, never moving more than half a step ahead, never allowing the distance between himself and the boy to widen more than necessary. When Eli stopped suddenly to pick up a yellow maple leaf from the grass, Brutus stopped at once, sat down beside him, and waited with the patience of a creature that has no idea waiting could ever be an inconvenience. Alaric stayed anchored to the stone path nearby, with his hands in the pockets of his coat, watching the two of them run across the yellow lawn. In his left pocket was a sheet of paper folded into 4 that Eli had slipped into his hand that morning before leaving the house, saying nothing, only handing it over and then going to change his shoes. He opened the paper for the first time while standing alone there, and looked at Eli's pencil drawing, 3 figures standing in front of the house on Astor Street, 1 tall man, 1 small child beside him, and 1 large animal seated in front of them, with the red scarf wrapped around its neck. There was no caption, no names, and none were needed. Alaric folded the paper again carefully along its original creases and placed it back into the left pocket, over his chest. The story of Brutus, Eli, and Alaric Kane reminds us that sometimes what a broken heart needs most isn't someone to come and repair it, but someone willing to sit down beside it and not rise and walk away. If this story touched something inside you, please hit like and share it with someone you think may need to hear it today. Tell us how you felt after following the journey of these 3 lives by leaving a comment below, because we truly want to hear what rose from the deepest place in your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new stories each day. Wishing you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. See you again in the next video.